First of all, thank you, Jeff, for that very kind introduction. And I would like to say how much I appreciate being invited here. I know many of the growers from this part of the state, and it's always a pleasure to come back to Scottsbluff. And it's a pleasure to come back for this specific event. Okay, now I'm trying to make sure I know how to, there we go, good. So what I want to do today is we're going to set the stage for the movie. We're going to talk a little bit about agriculture and then the need. And for those of you that know me, this will be a bit of a celebration for agriculture, but also giving you the context of where this movie may have come from and where we are today, actually, also. So let's start with the concept of the history on feeding the world. And basically, throughout history, poverty and food insecurity were always accepted. And it had two basic reasons for doing that. The first one was it's impossible to feed everyone. We just don't have the capacity. Or two, not everybody is worthy of being fed. Now, everyone living in a food-secure world is a very new idea. It probably began in the Age of Enlightenment. So if you think about it, if 10,000 years of recorded history, in the last 200 to 300, we came up with the concept that we could feed everybody. And so that means that just the very most recent layer of history is when we came up that people should be fed and we could do it. And it doesn't mean that everybody actually accepts that even today. So let's go back and look at one of the greatest famines that ever occurred, which was the Irish potato famine. And it was basically the years of 1845 to 1851. 1 out of every 8 Irish persons died, and 1 out of every 8 immigrated. So the country lost 1/4 of its population to outmigration or to death in the span of 6 years. I bring this up because the person who was the head of the Irish Relief Administrator was a man by the name of Charles Edward Trethewey, and his view on the famine was the following. God had sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson, and it must not be too much mitigated. A direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence. His belief was that the Irish potato famine was brought onto the Irish for their actions. It was a message from God, and to feed the Irish in the time of famine would be to disrespect God and to not have the Irish learn a famine, the lessons of the famine. 1/8 died, 1/8 immigrated. And the person who was in charge to prevent that has this belief. How'd that work out? 1/8 died, 1/8 immigrated. Later on, G.K. Chesterton described famine this way. It was a tragic necessity that the Irish should remember it, but it was a far more tragic that the Irish forgot it. For he who has forgotten his sin is repeating it incessantly forever. And the idea behind that quote is that if you think about famines, we learn very little from them, unfortunately. And this is the history of what famines are about. So, I'm in agriculture. Many of the audience probably farm or know people who farm. I always love this quote, and it really sets the perspective of what we were looking at. Few scientists think of agriculture as the chief or model science. Many, indeed, do not consider it a science at all. Yet it was the first science that makes all human life possible, and it may well be that before the century is over, the success or failure of science as a whole will be judged by the success or failure of agriculture. Now, that was written in 1974. That's 1 year after this movie was made. I want to put it in context, okay? So that's a view 1 year after this movie was made. For those of you that know I'm a wheat breeder, you got to go back to Socrates. No man or woman qualifies as a statesman who is entirely ignorant of the problems of wheat. Okay? It just shows you the importance of agriculture from Socrates and before to the modern day. Now, when I was 17, a book came out in 1968 by Paul Ehrlich. He was a National Academy of Science member, the highest honor you can receive probably outside of the Nobel Prize in the United States. Okay? He was an ecologist, and I'm 17 years old, and this is what he says. The battle to feed all humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. 17 years old, and this is what you read. A population of 2 billion people, hundreds of millions, which would be 100 million would be 5%, 200 million would be 10% of the world is going to starve to death, and you can't do a thing about it. That was his view. And so what people decided was the correct thing to do was the lifeboat response, which is if you have too many people in the lifeboat, it's going to capsize and everybody's going to die. So once you get the lifeboat full, you push everybody else away. So with starvation looming, the only thing left to do was to choose who would be in that boat and who would be left out of the boat. And whole countries in the 1970s were expected to have massive, unavoidable, and because of the lifeboat response, totally acceptable human losses on a scale that we've not seen since the plagues. And that's what you're growing up with. Now, this is the best quote that I think comes out in a long time. With monotonous regularity, apparently competent men who've laid down the law about what is technically possible or impossible and have been proved utterly wrong, sometimes while the ink was scarcely dry from their pens. On careful analysis, it appears that these debacles fall into two classes, which I call failures of nerve and failures of imagination. Because while Paul Ehrlich wrote that book, there were two men and teams working to change that future. One was Norman Borlaug, one was Hank Beechel. Okay? And it was the Green Revolution, which happened in the 70s. That's why you never heard of these massive famines. Something changed, and it was the Green Revolution. They took the right genes, put them in the right crops. 20% of the world gets their calories from wheat, 20% of their protein, 20% of the world gets their calories from rice. 40% of all the calories consumed by humanity, 2 crops. Okay? And they changed those crops. Give you a little bit of an idea about Norman Borlaug. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his work. There is no Nobel Prize for agriculture, so he had to be given the Peace Prize. He had the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Congressional Gold Medal. And to date, only 6 people in the world have ever had that trifecta. Martin Luther King, Elie Wiesel, Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, and Aung San Suu Kyi. I like Henry Beechel. He was born in Waverly, Nebraska. You can go up and see his birthplace. He's a UNL alumnus. We're really proud of that. He was the key person for the Green Revolution in rice. Norm was in wheat. And he was a World Food Prize recipient, which Norm Borlaug said if there is no Nobel Prize for food and agriculture, we ought to make one, and he made the World Food Prize. And it's the equivalent of the Nobel Prize, but for agriculture. You won it with Gurdjieff Kush. If you want to look at where the hunger map is today, this is it. And the countries that are in blue were in pretty good shape. As the colors become progressively darker from that yellow to the deep maroon almost, that's where the hunger becomes more and more severe. So it's still a problem that exists today. It's It's largely in Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Northern South America. But I want you to understand one thing. Hunger is the world's greatest solvable problem. That's a quote from the World Food Program. Now, food security is built on three pillars. It's a three-legged stool, you might say. The first one is food availability. Sufficient quantities of food available on a consistent basis. That's why I got into agriculture. I wanted to ensure I could contribute to the world having enough food should we need it. The second one is food accessibility, to having sufficient resources to attain appropriate foods for a nutritious diet. The third one is food use, appropriate use based on knowledge of basic nutrition and care, as well as adequate water and sanitation. So the first pillar, you have to be able to have enough food to feed everybody. The second pillar is those that are starving have to have access to food. Okay? They have to have the resources to do it. Farmers can't go out of business by giving food away. That won't work. That just decreases the food available to all. And the last one is you have to have the knowledge how to use that food. And that's where you come up with the concepts of hidden hunger, where you can have enough calories but not enough minerals, or have enough calories but not enough protein. You have to have proper quantities of food. That's what makes you food secure. Availability, access, and use. So if you look at the current challenges to agriculture, we predict that we'll have 9 billion people around 2043, expected to reach 10 billion 2083. You also have increasing wealth, because here's something which most people don't recognize, is we're a little between 6 and 7 billion people right now. When you get to 9 billion, they are not going to eat like 9 billion people eat today. Because they hopefully should have more wealth, and that's a good thing, they're going to eat like 12 billion people. We're going to have to double the amount of food available in the next 25 years. That's what we're looking at. By the way, that's a genetic gain or a gain in production that is unparalleled in human history. That's the challenge. 2016, roughly 800 million people went to bed hungry every day. 1 out of 4 children are stunted. 66 million attend classes while hungry, which hurts their ability to learn. Undernutrition contributes to half the deaths of all children under the age of 5. That's the stark reality. Okay? We also have to think about the bio-based economy, renewable resources, and we're going to do this probably in a time of climate change. What does this mean for agriculture in the next 50 years? It means that the rates of gain or increase that are needed will be unprecedented based upon lower yields of the past. If you have to increase yield by 10% and you're working with, say, 4 metric tons per hectare, that's 400 kilograms. In the 1960s, the average yield was 1 ton per hectare. So if you increased it 10%, it was only 100 kilograms per hectare. That's a huge difference. The low-hanging fruit have already been harvested. Agriculture is going to have to play a much greater role in the future, similar to what it was during the Green Revolution. And then the last one, which you have to understand, is no one has ever starved in recent history due to the lack of food. We always look, we say we've got surpluses. Yeah, we do. Does that mean everybody's going to be fed? No, it doesn't. You don't have access? That's the issue. So laying that down, I just wanted to give you a little bit about where I come from, the needs and contributions of Nebraska. Every wheat variety I release has to have 4 characteristics. The first one is it has to survive the winter. You see that empty spot in the upper left corner? That's winter kill. It has to be resistant to stem rust. That's the one right below it. That's the biblical black plague of Moses. Came and destroyed the wheat crop of Egypt. We get it here, has to be resistant. It has to have good agronomic performance. That's what the field yield trials look like. And then it has to make a loaf of bread. That's what the lower right corner is, an indication of how well things work. Okay? Now, so that's what my breeding program works on, and that's what I love doing, and I have to thank the University of Nebraska for letting me do it for 32 years. So what have we gotten out of that program? The impact of the program that I lead with in collaboration with the USDA is that if you look at the total production in 2010, and I can update these, we produced about almost 4 billion pounds of wheat. And the value was just over about $500 million. Now, the increase due to genetics was about 20% of that. So it meant that of that $500 million, what breeders did was about $100 million worth. Okay? Now, I can't take credit for all of that because my varieties aren't grown everywhere in the state. But about 2/3 of all the wheat that's grown in this state is due to the genetics that I and my colleagues have developed, working with people like Jeff and a whole number of other great team members. So if you take that $107 million and multiply it by 2/3, roughly $71 million at the farm gate is added every year. Now, the university and the USDA federal government probably invests $3 to $4 million, and they get a $71 million return annually. Are you happy with that rate of return? Would you wish your bank could give that to you? Okay. I appreciate everything a farmer does. I love that we make them more productive, hopefully make them more profitable. But I didn't get into this business for that reason. If you take that same 4 billion pounds of wheat and you figure out how many people that feeds on an annual basis, it's about 20 million people. A state of Nebraska with about 2 million people, our wheat crop alone feeds 20 million people. Again, I can't take credit for that because the genetics are about 20%. So of that 20 million people, we feed about 4.1 million people due to what breeders do. And again, I can't take credit for that because my wheats aren't grown everywhere. But 2/3 of the state are produced in my wheats. So 2.7 million people get their annual consumption of wheat from the research that the University of Nebraska, through the generous support of the state of Nebraska and the USDA and our federal government. That's what keeps me going 24/7. When someone knows the phrase, "Give us this day our daily bread," that's what we work on. Now, the last thing I want you to remember is a good past is positively dangerous if it makes us content with the present and unprepared for the future. So everything that a scientist does is to work towards that better future. And that's what our goal would be. We've had a great past. My predecessors, John Schmidt, Virgil Johnson, were unbelievable breeders. But we can't be content, not unless you're willing to accept starvation. With that, I'd like to thank you and see if there are perhaps a few questions. I think Jeff's coming up.